Hi class, this lecture is on Excel macros. Excel macro is basically a piece of code or a set of instructions that can be used to automate tasks within Excel. They're usually written they're written in Visual Basic for Applications programming language, and this is an inbuilt programming language within Excel. And macros find a wide range of applications, including data importing, formatting, sorting, data visualization through charts, performing iterative calculations, optimizations using solver, Excel solver, statistical functions, etc. It also helps you develop your own functions that you can either call locally within a workbook or across all workbooks in your computer. It could also help you generate reports. And these are some of the tasks that are possible. There could be more um, uh, than what is shown here. And these macros can be created by simply recording your actions or by writing a code from scratch in the Excel VBA editor. VBA basically stands for Visual Basic for Applications. Okay. Now, where do we find the Excel macro? The Excel macro is part of the developer ribbon in your Excel. A lot of times this developer ribbon may not be enabled. If it's not, let's go to an Excel. So in my case, I have the developer ribbon and I have a lot of macro features in here, including the code, editing portion, recording portion, and then there are some add-ins. And then I have the controls and the XML features here. So if you don't have the developer, the way to enable it is go to File, Options, go to Customize Ribbon, and then click on Developer. Okay. If developer is not on this side, you'll have to find all commands on this side and look for developer and move it to this side and click Enable. Okay. So that's how you find the Excel macro. Now, I'm gonna jump ahead and talk about macro security for a little bit, because macro files, it's there is a risk of viruses entering your computer and running applications. If you download any Excel macro from the internet, there's a chance of viruses in them, viruses or malware. So because of that, so you have to enable the security settings. So let's try opening one of the Excel macro files. So this is an macro enabled Excel file. I'm going to try to open it. Let's see what happens. You see, I get a security warning. Macros have been disabled. Okay, so I cannot use this macro. To use this, I have to enable the content. Now I can use it. So only if you recognize the file and you think it's a safe file, it is from this class or it is a macro that you created, you can enable it. Now, how do you set that feature? For that, again, you have to go to File, Options, Trust Center, go to Macro, Trust Center Settings, go to Macro Settings, and disable VBA macros with notification. That's what you want to select. So that means whenever the macro tries to run or somebody tries to open a macro in your computer, it will not run unless you enable it. Okay, and these settings is what I recommend for you to have on your computer. Never enable VBA macros completely. Okay, that can risk dangerous code running on a computer. All right, so having said that, let's move on to the next topic, which is recording a macro. Okay, so here we mentioned macros can be created by either recording your actions or by writing a code from scratch. Okay, let's start with recording your actions. And this course primarily would be about um, developing macros by recording. Okay, you will be able to do a little bit of editing of your recorded macro, but to teach um, writing from scratch, it will take a different course or more lectures. So we'll brush up or we'll just touch the surface of macros through recording macro options. Okay. All right. Let's open up a new Excel file. Um, and what we'll do is I will try to create a macro or a set of instructions. And that instructions is for um, making sure I can generate a function or calculate a function in several rows. Okay. So in this case, I will, before I start recording the macro, I will provide the input to the macro, which will be these columns. Okay. Let's say I have a value x, and if and I have to perform some function on this x, which we'll define when we run the macro. So with this as the input, I'm ready to start recording the macro. Okay. And when you record the macro, you should already plan your steps ahead such that you don't do unnecessary steps that also get recorded. Okay. And also make your steps very clean and not confusing. No copy pasting and deleting and no selecting unnecessary cells, all that. Okay. Do simple steps which will not confuse the code. Now go to developer, go to this section here and click record macro. In this case, you can name your macro anything except that it couldn't have a space. This will not work. And you cannot have a number in front of the macro. This will not work. Okay. So I'm gonna rename it with something else. Maybe I'll call it function number or function one. Okay. So this is one particular type of function I'm creating. I'm not choosing a shortcut key. I don't want to create a shortcut for this. I'll just click OK. And you can see that it says stop recording now. Okay, that means the macro is being recorded, and when you finish, you can hit the stop recording button. Okay, so every action I take now will be recorded. So the first action I'll do is I'll create a header here for the function that I'm going to use to calculate this column D. And it could be any function. In this case, I'm going to choose a logarithmic function um, of x times x cubed minus, um, let's say, square root of x squared plus x. Sorry, you shouldn't have done that because those are unnecessary steps. Okay, so that will be my function, and I'll try to copy that formula here. Equal to log of this number times that cube minus square root function of this squared plus this again. Okay, so it gave us a number. We'll drag this. Okay, and then I'm gonna format it, probably make it bold, make it a little bit wider, and I'm gonna format these cells to not have so many decimals. Maybe I'll reduce the decimals. Okay. and I will change the color of this to that. I'll change the color of this to this. Okay, let's move this like this. Okay, at this point, I will go to developer and stop recording. Okay, now assuming the macro is recorded, I should be able to delete this, remove all the formatting, go back here. Now I'll go to developer again, try to find the macro that I recorded. In this case, it was function 1, and I'm gonna hit run to see what happens. Okay, so it has recorded the macro and it did what I wanted it to do. Okay, now I also want to make sure I want to clean this. Okay, to make sure that if I change the number here, I would like to actually start with a clean sheet. So what I'll do is I'll record a cleaning macro and I'll call it clean underscore 1. And in this workbook, okay, so what I'll do is first reduce this and then clean all these cells, make sure they don't have any formatting, and then I click back here, developer stop recording. Okay, go back to macros, and I have the clean function there. So I'll run the function 1, got this, go back to macros, run the clean function, and it cleans. Okay, so we got some basic macros recorded that can calculate a function, uh, write headers, and also clean it. Now it's a pain to go here every time, search for the macro and run it. Okay, it'll be great if there was a button to turn this on or off. So uh, you're lucky that there is such a feature. So let's go to insert and insert this form control button here. Okay, when you insert it, it'll ask you to select the macro that you want to associate that button with. So in this case, I will associate the function macro for that button, and I'll call it the f of x button. And I'll insert another one for the cleaning. I'll associate that with the clean button, clean macro. I'll hit clean here. Okay, and let's move these. You can right click and move them. I'd right click and move them to a little bit to the side. So I can click f of x, it'll give me this values. I can hit clean, it goes back to nothing. So I can change the numbers here to anything else, 34.9, some other numbers, and hit f of x, it'll create the new values. Clean, it'll remove those. Okay, so you've created a good macro very simply by just recording it. Okay, you haven't written any code. If you wanted to see where your code is, first thing to do is you should save this file. You should save this as, um, let's go to a place where we can save this. Let's call it function 1 example, and then you don't save them as Excel workbook, you have to save them as Excel macro enabled workbook. Okay, if you don't save it as an Excel macro enabled workbook, which is basically .xlsm, you will not be able to save the macro and you cannot use that macro anymore. You lose it. So we have saved it as the right file. Now what we do is to find where the code is, remember this name, go to the Visual Basic, it'll open the Project Explorer, And this is not the view I wanted. I will open the Project Explorer like that. Okay, if you didn't open in the Project Explorer window, go to View and hit Project Explorer. Okay, here I will look for my file. This is function one example. Inside that, I will go to the module section and double click on the modules. That's where the function one macro and the clean macro both are. Okay, so this is the code that has happened. Remember the function that you wrote on the cell, that I wrote on the cell? It just copied that. Okay, and then it copied the formula that I did on the active cell, which was D5. Okay, and then it copied the drag function that I did, and it also did the formatting of numbers, colors, all that. It copied all that. Now, let's close this out. So that was the Project Explorer. Um, sorry, let's go back and open the function one example. So enable content. So now here, what if I have more data than this? I create the function of x. It's not able to calculate the remaining ones. Okay. The problem is you recorded the macro for only this many rows. Ideally, there are several ways to fix this in your code directly. Let's just try to use some tricks and see whether we can fix this easily. So let's say you right now have until row 10. We want to take it to row 16. Okay. So go back to the developer, Visual Basic, go to your module and look for where is okay. So here you can see it's selecting up to range 10. So if you change all those range 10 to range 16, D16, okay, you can look for all the places that you find D10, find next, okay, and you can replace that one also with 16, find next, okay, no more, close it, close this here, go back and clean, hit FFX again. You see now it calculated till D16. So you are able to record a macro and also do a little bit of editing, okay? And you're able to change the code, okay? All right. So in this example, what all did we do? We were able to record a macro, format, which included formatting cells, adding formula to cells, then also assigning buttons to the macro for two operations. One was to find the function and then for cleaning it. Then we were also able to change the code to increase the number of rows that we wanted to um, operate on. Okay. We can get to the VBA editor in two different ways. One is to go through the developer tab and through the Visual Basic icon here, or like it's showing here, you could also use Alt plus F11 shortcut. So I'm gonna try using the Alt plus F11 shortcut. Yeah, it directly gets you to the Project Explorer like this. Okay. Now, going through here, what exactly is there in the VB editor? Okay. So basic structure of a VBA code. There are two types of VBA codes. One is for subroutines, like typical macros that you write. The other is functions, okay? So the typical subroutines will have the macro name. It will start with as sub and end with end sub. And then you will have the macro name with the two brackets. You'll have your code and comments inside it, okay? And then it will be accessible within that workbook. Uh, or throughout the Excel application, depending on where you save it. Okay. Functions are a little bit different. the they basically output a value. Okay. Um, so their syntax is a little bit different. You have to provide the data type of the function and also its argument that goes into it. Um, and then it'll return a value at the very end. So you'll have to put the function name, whatever name you gave here, and then what it should return. It could be a formula or a value. Okay. And you can define variables within this function, and that'll be used to calculate the final function value. Now, within the VBA code, um, there are several objects. Okay, there are several object types that you will see when you record a macro. You will sometimes see an application object. Okay, it will say application dot workbook dot something. Okay, and then there's a workbook object, and there's a worksheet object, range object, cell object, chart objects. So it's referring to different objects that could be present in your Excel. So um, when you look at your Excel, the workbook is the whole file. So this function underscore example, it's referring to this whole file. And if it's referring to a worksheet with a particular name, it's referring to this sheet. So it could access data from any sheet here. It could create a new sheet. It could delete a sheet. It could open a new workbook from a certain folder. All of that. So for accessing all those objects, we need to define objects, and VBA has these objects defined with these names. Okay, and different cells, they're called as cells too. Like you can use the cells object to refer to individual cells, and then there's a range object to select a particular range or an array of cells. Then the chart object for selecting charts, um, etc., etc. There's a lot more objects than this that I've shown here, but these are the primary ones. And you can see some of the codes will look like this. In this particular case, you're giving a name to a worksheet, in this case WS, okay, and it's referring to sheet number 1. And then it's looking at a range of values in A1 to A10 within that sheet. So things like that. So that's basically the object types in VBA. Then there are several variables and data types in Excel. I think almost all data types are possible in Excel. There are integers, long numbers, which are large whole numbers, single and double. They are both decimal numbers. The double has more precision and it can describe much larger and much smaller numbers than the single precision. I would always recommend to use double. I mean, I don't see a need to use single when you're trying to use decimal numbers. String is basically for text type data, Boolean for true or false, and variant is when you don't know what data type your input is, so you can have a wide range. Okay, and these are examples of how you initialize your variable with the data type. So in this case, in the beginning of the code, I will write dimension time as double, dimension name as string, etc. And within Excel, there are several control structures. So you can have several conditions for your logic, like if then statements, for loops, while loops, all of that are possible. So if you want to iterate for a number of times, so if you can use a for loop for I equal to 1 to n, do this, calculate the formula until it converges or things like that. You could also do something similar if you don't know how much time it will take or how many iterations it will take. You can just say, whenever this is less than this, do this, or whenever this is greater than this, continue doing that. Okay, so the while went uh, loops. You also have the if, then, else if, and if type statements. So if this, then do this. If not, then do this. Um, and you can have multiple ifs and else ifs, and in the end you can end that. So a lot of complex logics can be written, okay, with the control structures possible in Excel. So having said all this, let's create a simple VBA without using the record macro function. So I promised most of this lecture was primarily about recording macro, but I think we should also have a little bit of flavor of how to write a simple macro by ourselves. Okay, and this is very simple. This will just create a message box like this, and you can see the code structure. It's calling this message box object with this, and then you can type in whatever you want to output there using that. Okay, so let's try that really quick in this file. So where should we write our code? So you have book one here. I'm gonna save that as a macro enabled file first. I'll call it hello class. Okay, and then we'll go into developer. Okay, Visual Basic. We'll look for the hello class file, and I'll go to insert and insert module. Now we got the module folder and a module here. This is where you write your code. Okay, so we can say sub hello class and sub. Now inside this we'll write whatever we want to write on the message box. Okay, so I type something in here and I can close this, go back here, go to macros. There's the hello class macro already there. I'll run it. It says hello class, this is an Excel macro lecture. Okay, like we did before, we can easily insert a button and we'll tie it to here. And okay, call it hello, and now we click it, it shows up like that. Okay, as simple as that. So we created a macro ourselves by creating the module and writing the code in there. So the subroutine basically. So that was easy. We'll save it, close. Now let's go back to our. The next thing is, so you're able to write a macro with the VBA. Next thing is creating a function. This is probably not possible with recording feature anyway. So this has to be done in the VB editor. So here, what I'm trying to do is create a new function. Okay, so let's look at existing trigonometric functions. So I have an angle and it's usually in degrees. Okay, and I want to find the sine of that angle. Okay, so if sine 30, we know that it's 0.5. If I use the sine function, it's not returning 0.5. Why is that? It's because in Excel, the inbuilt sine is in radians. So I usually need to convert this into radians, right? So how do I convert this? I multiply it with pi divided by 180. So it'll convert it to a lower value. Now, if I take a sine of that, I should get 0.5. Why is this so hard, right? So it will make it easier if there was, because how many people talk about angles in radians? We normally talk about angles in like So 25-degree angle, 10-degree angle. So we normally talk about angles like that, and it's kind of a pain in Excel to always calculate, convert that to radians. So let's create a function that will directly convert angles to angles in degrees to the sine function. Okay, so that's what this example is trying to do. And the same thing for the cos and the tan functions. Okay, so I'll just copy this code. Okay, I will go here. So at this point, when I try to search for sine, there's only this sine function showing up. Okay, now look what happens. Go to developer. Um, First, let's save this file as a macro-enabled file. And let's call this VBA functions. Okay, so we have saved this to that. Let's go to Visual Basic, find VBA functions, insert your new module, and put your all these new function codes in here. I have this unnecessary line here. So now we have all three functions: sine degrees function, cos degrees function, and tan degrees function. Okay, so it's what it's doing is it's converting inside this function the angle in degrees to angle in radians. Okay, so the function looks for a value which is a double, means it could be a decimal, and function outputs a value that's also a double. Okay, and then you define a new variable which is the radians, and you convert the input into radians, and then use the existing sine function in Excel to calculate it, and you report the final value as the output of your function. Do the same thing for um, the other tan and cos also. Okay, so now we close this out. Go back here. We should be able to, let's move. Okay, let's call this sine degrees. Okay, so here if I hit equal to and search for sine, now a new function is here, sine degrees. Okay, now I've created a new function, and I'll click this number here. It matches these numbers. Okay, so you have created a new function, as simple as that. But right now this function is only available within um, um, this particular Excel file. Okay, so you can see sine degrees. You can find the tan of that, and also the cos. Um, tan degrees, because we also created that one. Hit enter. So you have a tan degrees function, and then you have a cos degrees. Cos degrees function. So cos 30 is that. Let's do 45 degrees. So tan 45 is 1. Sine and cos 45 is 0.7. 1 over square root 2, I think. So all of those numbers are correct. Okay, and you have made a function. So that's that. The next would be an example in control structures. Okay, so let's look at an example of writing codes from scratch for an if-then example. In this case, it is asking you to enter a date or time or any type of input in the cell, and it will tell you what data type it is. So user, it's asking user for an input in the input box, and then It is checking whether that input is a number, it's a date or time, or is it empty string, and whether it's a text. Okay, so let's try this in a new Excel file. So let's create a new macro-enabled workbook. Let's call this logic example, and go to developer, Visual Basic, find the logic example and insert module. Copy this code, okay, and close it, close out. Now go to developer and macros. Um, check input type is the name we gave that macro. Um, instead of directly running it, I would rather add um, control button, and I'll call it, I'll assign it to check input type, data type, I'll call it that. Okay, now if I click this, okay, there is a compiler. Maybe we had the wrong code. Oh, I didn't end the sub. So I should do end sub and save it, close it, click this again. Okay, now it works. Input type checker, enter value. So I will just write my name, which is a text. Okay, you enter a text. Okay, click again. Now I'll try to enter a date. You enter a date or time. I could change again. I could enter a time like this, 5 p.m. It recognizes it's a date or time. I will try to just enter some blank space. Click OK. You entered an empty string. And I click one more time and enter a number. You enter a number. Okay. So this macro works. So it's using, if you go back to it, um, you can go directly here this way too. So the check input type is using several if, else, and if type statements. Okay. So it's checking through your input whether if it is this, then report that. If it's not, then go to the next line. Then go to the next line. And if it's nothing else, then it'll say it's a text. Okay, and then end if. So that was the an example of how to write a macro on your own using the if-then conditions. Okay, let's look at the next example, which is using the for loop for cycling through the numbers. Okay, so in this case, it's asking the user, how many rows do you want? Please enter the number of rows needed. And then it is using that input from the user to create a lot of numbers in column A. Okay, so if you enter 9, it will go from 1 to 9. Okay, let's quickly see how this works. So let's open this, um, create a new file. Let's call this for loop. Okay, um, and then developer, Visual Basic. Where's the for loop? Okay, here. Insert module. Let's copy paste our code here. So the name of the macro is fill numbers. Okay, and close this out. close this out, close this out. And here, let's go to insert and make this tied to fill numbers. Call this for loop. Okay, click this, enter the number of rows needed. I want 5 rows. Click OK. It's 5 rows of numbers. Okay, if I change it to 100, click OK. It has entered almost 100 rows. So that was a simple for loop logic. So let's look at the logic again. You can go here and click edit. It should go into this section here. So basically it's looking for enter the row needed for I equal to 1 to that max row. Keep writing this value of I in cells I1. So cell I1 is cell row number and column number. The column number is 1, means it's row A. Sorry, column A. Cell I, if I is 1, is A1. If I is 2, it's A2. Okay, so this is the row number. This is the column number. 1 represents A, and um, and 2 represents B, 3 represents C, etc. So why don't we change this to 3? Okay. Uh, Sorry. Let's change this to 3 and close it. So you see, it was writing this in here. Now it should write on column C. So let's click this and write 100 numbers again. Click OK. See, now it start writing it in column C instead of A. Okay. All right. So that was the for loop. Let's also look at while loop really quick. Um, Maybe I don't need to show that example. It's very straightforward. Instead of using the for loop, in this case, almost the same output where you um, um, put in a number here, it will do the same thing as the for loop. But in this case, it's checking whether I is less than a value. Okay, if I is less than a value, then inside the code you're asking to add y. Okay, in the for loop there was no need to add I equal to I plus 1. It'll automatically it will increase by to the next I value. Okay, in the while loop you're putting this code that um, I equal to I plus 1 for the next row. Okay, all right. Now let's look at some more useful macros that can be created using the record macro feature. Okay, so in this case, um, this is a formatting macro. So let's say you want to format the headers as the headers here based on this format, and this date is in actually a number right now. You want to format into this form. Same goes for time. Humidity, you want to format it as a fraction, and the temperature you want to format it as a fraction, and all of these with this color and this one with this header format. Okay, this in this case the macro simply does this and it takes care of all the formatting right away. Okay, so how do we create this macro? Let's start from scratch. Let's copy these. Let's copy all these um, in a different Excel file and start this recording and create the macro again. So I'll paste all those in there and I will use these sample formats in here. Okay, it doesn't have to be this. We could change this to this, and these could be more like um, this, for example. Okay, so the way to create this would be, now that we have everything here, go to File, Save As, Browse, and save this file as an Excel macro enabled workbook. Let's call it formatting example. Okay. So now we'll go to developer and record a macro. Okay, we'll call it format example. Okay, so the macro is running. So what we should do here is first copy the formats of the date column and then paste the formats on that column. So I already copy and pasted the format. Okay. So let's verify. Yeah. So I only copied and pasted the format. So I'll do the same thing for the rest of the columns. Formatting. Okay. So now that I've copied all of them, I could copy the format of the headers here. Copy. All right. So now I'm finished. So this should be time to stop recording. Okay. So macro is finished. We can already input the button and tie it to the formatting X macro. Call it format. Okay. And let's change these things again. Um, let's change this to this form. Let's change all of these to um, or different for different ones, you know. Um, okay. So now we hit format. So we got different formatting for different cells the way we want it. Okay. So that was a simple way to change, and you can change any format you want based on changing the values here, because the macro is referring to the format here and then copy pasting that format here. Okay, so that was that macro. Let's close that. Let's look at another macro which will be using statistical functions. In this particular case, a descriptive statistics function. Okay, so this was there in your previous lecture on um, descriptive statistics. Um, so if I wanted to create the descriptive statistics, what I normally do is I go to data and I go to data analysis. It's a little bit slow. Okay, and then go to descriptive statistics, click OK, and then I go to the input range, select all of these, and then I select the labels and I select the output range. Let's say I want it here, and then click OK. Oh, I have to choose summary statistics, and it gave me this. So it was not very simple. I had to go through multiple places to select my data and then make other selections, etc. In this macro, you can do all that by just clicking this button. So, and then this macro helps clear it. So it is really simple. We can try doing this ourselves in a separate macro. So let's put this in here. Um, we'll save the file in the end. Let's go to developer and um, record a macro. Okay, then in this case, we have to go now to data and data analysis, descriptive statistics, and we have to select everything from here to here. Okay, labels in first row, output range, let's select here, and summary statistics, let's click OK. All right, and we could also give it a color formatting, okay, and make this bold, for example. All right, at this point, let's stop recording, and we could delete all this, insert a form control, and I guess we didn't put a name for this macro, so let's go to select the macro 2, and let's call it statistics. Okay, hit enter. You got all the statistics in one click. Okay, so that's a good example of um, you know enabling the data analysis functions through macro. Okay, you could do that with a lot of other functions in here too. You could do the regression that we have looked at before also in here. Okay, all right, so we don't have to save this file. I'll just delete that one. Now let's look at a um, chart creating macro. So this is one of the most difficult macros to create through the recording option, because it will never work, especially if you have to have multiple access, secondary access, all that, and you have to reference a named range. In this example, you can see that I've created names for my x-axis, y-axis, etc., so that uh, when the size of the x-axis and y-axis changes, it could still work. You know, um, so doing all that made this macro a little bit difficult. And if you look at the macro code um, in the Visual Basic, you will see that I had put in a lot of comments wherever I had to change fix problems. Okay, you can see I had to change this line, these 4 lines. I had to change some things in here. So some of the main problems with recording a macro like this is, for example, it's referencing this particular Excel SM file. So if you change the name of our file, this macro will not work because it's looking for this particular name. So this is not the right way to write the code, okay? It should work regardless of whatever name your file has. And also it's referencing to the chart's name, chart number 11. So I had to change that and just say chart object activate. So a lot of errors were there when I recorded this and I had to edit it. Let's see how it works for now. So right now it's trying to tell what is the name of the um, axis and at what column, all that. So create chart, create a chart like this with the data here. And if you wanted to change the data, okay, now let's delete this, change the data here, and it automatically calculated the new hours and extended the time for extra data. So the table automatically expanded and it found the end row, all that. So if you create the chart now, it should show a chart with a lot more data. So yeah, so it's working to create charts. Okay, so you can use this as an example when you want to create your own chart creation macro. All right, let's close this and look at a solver example. or an Excel optimizer example. Um, so in this case, let's look at optimization macro. So what this macro is doing is it's optimizing a function. It's finding the max, min, or it is setting that function to a value. I'll show you as soon as this opens. Okay, so there's an objective function. This could be any function. Okay, and it's tied to one variable, which is variable x in this column. So this function is tied to this variable. And the constraints on that variable are, it is in between these two numbers. Okay, so you have to maximize, minimize, and set to a target value this cell. So let's start with some initial number here and say I want to maximize this within a range of 0.5, or no, from 2 to 67. I want to find the maximum value of this function. So if I hit maximum, it ran the solver, and I click OK. So the maximum value is this value, and it's maximized at the max value of x. Okay, you can do the same thing with minimize. So minimum value within this range is 62.82, and that happens at 2. Okay, what if you want to set it to a target of 2000, or so maybe 10,000? Okay, find the target value, or find this x value that will set this objective function to 10,000. So we want to get 10,000 here. So for this, I'm changing the objective function here, and trying to minimize this. So this is a difference between these two. And if you minimize this, that means this value and this value will be almost the same. Okay, so if you hit this, this is almost 0, and this value and this value kind of match, and that happens at 10.63. So and again, you can have your own function in here. I could just multiply this whole thing with exponent of this number divided by 10. Okay, and I can maximize this again. So I change the function, it still works. I can minimize. So you could put any function here as long as you're referencing this variable, and you're okay with this constraint, So yeah, so it works that way. How did I do this? I can show this just for the maximize function. Um, let's just copy these numbers into a new file. Okay. Target value. Let's try to create all of this one more time. Okay, so we have the function, we have the variable, we have the constraints, we have this target. Think let's move that here. Okay, so let's try to do the maximize function. So what we should do is go to developer, record macro, let's call it optimize notebook, so it's recording, and go to data analysis. Sorry, we have to go to solver, and we have to do max, and what we're maximizing is this cell. Our variable is this cell, and our constraints are add variable is less than or equal to 67, add, then variable greater than or equal to 2. Okay, so we have added the constraints. This is a good constraint to have, GRG nonlinear. Hit solve. Okay, it's solved. Hit OK. So now we have finished our calculation. Go here, stop recording. Okay, Let's insert, sorry, go to developer and insert a maximize function. Oh no, we have to select this one. Let's rename this as maximize. Okay, now this most likely will not work. Let's check whether this works or not. Okay, it's not working. It is having an issue with using the solver in Excel VBA. The reason for that is you haven't enabled solver for this particular file in the VBA. So to do that, you have to go to, I believe, tools, options. No, hold on. It should be in, let's first get out of this and go to VBA again and tools, references. Okay, go to references and then there should be solver. You have to enable solver. Click OK. All right. Now you have done that for this book one where you are creating this. Now let's click this again. Now it works. Okay, it's maximizing it. Let's change this to 90 and maximize this again. It's changing the variable. If you go to Visual Basic and look at your code, this is where it's checking whether you want to maximize or minimize. So if you change this value to 2, instead of maximizing, it should try to minimize. Okay, let's see whether that works. So now it should actually minimize the value. So yes, now it's minimizing it. So that way, you have created a way to use the Excel solver, which is a powerful feature in Excel to solve functions, solve your objective functions and optimize. All right. Okay, this is an example of a macro that is used for filtering a table. Okay, so this is similar to the assignment problem that you have for assignment number 10. So here you have a bunch of data that shows the name of the unit and the flow rate. It's similar to data you've looked at in one of your earlier assignments. So the goal is to create two sets of rows which looks at bad units, units that are higher flow units and units that are lower flow units. So any unit that has a flow rate higher than 45.5 and lower than 15.5. So you have to create two sets of columns, one for high and one for low. Okay. And in this case, we have set these max and min volume as such. So this macro is supposed to create these two columns, high flow units. All these values are above 45.5, and then low flow units where all the values here are um, lower than 15.5. Okay, so everything lower than 15.5. So and then you have to have another button created to clear all this data. And if I change this number again to 42, for example, and 16, for example, it should capture more units. So now there are more units that are that have this um, criterion. So how do we create this macro? So let's just first copy the input data into a new file, okay, and then copy the limits that are there for the for filtering. Okay, so now that we have this, we are ready to record a macro. So let's go to developer, record a macro, and let's call it filter 1. Okay, now the macro is being recorded. Let's first create a header file here, or header name. Let's call it high flow. And then another header close to it, calling it low flow. Okay, and let's create the unit label and flow rate. Same thing here for the low flow. Okay, we could also do some formatting. Now, for finding the high flow units, we'll use the filter function. You have used this before in one of the previous lectures. Okay, so the filter, now I have to put in the array where I want the answers from. So this is the unit number, so I have to select the unit number array. So I'll select all the units in there. Then I have to set the criterion. The criterion is all of these values, whichever ones are greater than 42. So I'm going to select these numbers in this array, and then my criterion is greater than 42, which is this cell. Put a comma and close it, hit enter. So I got all the units that are above 42 here. I can copy the same command. Now I want to output the flow rate. So instead of this column, basically I need to move that in here and select this column again. Hit enter. So I got all the unit numbers. Sorry, flow rate numbers. Same thing with the other data, but here we are looking for less than function. So this should be less than, and it should be less than this number. So those are different sets of units. And we can copy this here and modify to the code that we need. So less than 16. Okay, so now we got all of this macro done. It's time to stop the macro. Stop recording. Okay, now we can go back to developer, insert a form and call it, let's assign it to the filter macro and call it filter. Okay, and for now let's clean all this and see whether this macro works. Okay, so there is a problem with the paste special. For now, let's comment it and see whether this works. Okay. Let's try it again. Sometimes when you record macro, you get errors okay, if you do some unwanted actions, you get an error. So I just commented it and it seems to be working. Okay. All right. So now let's go record the cleaning macro. So go record button. Let's call it clean 1. Okay. So it's recording. So basically I will select these columns, delete, and I could say no border, no fill. Okay. And go back to developer, stop recording, insert form, tie it to the clean macro, and rename it as clean. So right now I should be able to create this filter and then clean. Okay, I could change this value to a different number, 5.6, 15.6. Okay, and filter that gives me less number of units, and I can verify. So this is all greater than 45.6. These are all less than 15.6. Okay, all right. So that concludes this lecture and also this class. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you found new things to learn. Um, Surely was a pleasure to teach this class. Thank you very much.